Okay. Okay. Let me do that. How to, Katie?
Yo.
I almost had it. You just can't see the arrow. That's the problem. There you go. All right. Sorry.
Did that work?
How does this thing work? And Katie, that top part, is that?
If you go to more, you should be able to
Hide it.
taskbar.
Just can't see.
Yeah, the arrow. There you
Hide floating meeting controls.
Oh.
All right, you're set.
go. Excellent. Hello. So we're going to talk today about not just plants. And so, although definitely the people in this room are obsessed with plants, and I'm obsessed with plants, but our whole thing is really about more than just plants, and that's ecology. Let's see if I can get this thing going here. There we go.
Down arrow would be advanced presentation.
I can go analog here.
Yeah.
All right, so, the arrows aren't working either, actually.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, sorry. So just quickly about us. We started our nursery around 5 years ago. I don't know, 5 years maybe. I have a hard time with time. We weren't really planning on starting a nursery when we first started. It was a complete accident. We were actually going to start another magazine, and we were talking to Katie's dad, and we were like, maybe we'll sell some plants on the weekend. And then it just avalanched from there, which is probably saying a lot more about how in the closet we were about plants. But anyway, here we are, and 5 years later, we're really into it. And that's not to say that I wasn't into plants before. I've been into plants my whole adult life, actually my whole life. And Katie reluctantly, until she became an adult, she grew up with her dad with plants, and then as a lot of kids do, came back to plants as an adult. We grow, when we first started, we were only going to grow native plants. And then we realized, well, that's hypocritical of us because we grow tomatoes. We grow food plants because we love food. So we started also providing especially cleanly grown organic vegetable, herb, fruit tree starts. And that's really hard to find because it's even things that are said they're organic. If you go to Home Depot and look at the organic brands that they have, they get them from California. You know what happens when they cross the border between California and Arizona? Even if they're organically grown, they spray them. So it's really hard to find actually organic plants. And so we felt that we should provide that. So we started growing that too. And then the third category is botanical curiosities. And that's like cacti and succulents that are not going to become weeds. But we realize that a lot of people get their love for plants by finding really cool succulents. And so every once in a while we'll have that too. But the majority of what we push are native plants. And and the emphasis, and no matter what we do, is that what we do supports wildlife, or at the very least does not harm it. And of course, the nursery started with this guy, and our namesake comes from him. In the 90s, when the family moved up to Cochise County, he started the nursery, and we've taken it on and expanded from what I think his vision was, for sure. But now you're probably used to, many people in this room have seen a talk from Petey Mesquitey, and you're probably expecting butts because he always showed a picture of him and his naked butt. And I'm not gonna show you our butts, but we definitely have our own secret side. Things that we do outside of the nursery, but not our butts. We're not going to show our butts tonight.
Next presentation.
Maybe the next one. So I think one of the things that really makes us a little bit different than other nurseries is most nurseries are run by horticulturists. and horticulturists are informed by agriculture. And we are we're ecologists, and we spend a lot of time on the field. We go to areas and we do floristic surveys, and we turn our data in. And we do it for ourselves, but this is where the perspective we come from and we bring to the nursery, which is, I think, very different than other nurseries. Most nurseries they're retail operations. A lot of them don't even grow plants, and then when they do, they come from an agricultural background. So that's how they learned how to interact with plants. In agriculture, plants are seen in isolation. Like, you look at the plant and everything else is an enemy. We're not like that. So it is frustrating sometimes, the expectations that people have for a regular nursery. We are not that at all. But we deal with those expectations. Our plants don't look like this. They don't all look the same. They're seed grown, a lot of them. We not that we don't do cuttings, we do, but most of our stuff is seed grown because we believe in genetic diversity. And it's slower, and plants look different. They don't look all the same. So there's that as well. This is what our trees look like, this is a 5-gallon Palo Verde. I mean, this is how we grow things. So, the Desert Survivors is a lot like this too, obviously. And so we literally started this nursery in our backyard. This is literally our backyard 5 years ago. We've come a long way since then, but, we're small stuff, basically. It's still just two of us who do everything. This is how most people grow stuff, and this is how we grow stuff. So it's not a commercial operation. I mean, it is, but it's run very differently. Katie posted this picture of me on social media and said I was living my best life. I have a headlamp on my head, I just realized, and I don't remember why I do.
Glass of wine.
And there's a glass of wine next to the dirt in a cup. So anyway, we feel like our biggest job is managing people's expectations of nature. And that's because of the relationship that people have with plants and with nature, where they get that relationship from. We're constantly dealing with that and managing that. This is a very typical nursery. This is probably in Phoenix. Those are ficus nitida. But this is what people want out of a tree in the nursery. They want it to have a trunk and a canopy and plants that look like trees. And where do we get this conception of what trees should look like? And this isn't just in nurseries. This is in the ground too. People have this concept of what a tree should be. And it comes from the north. This is a maple, Acer sacrum or whatever. And this, trees in the north evolved in an environment where there's a lot of trees. And so they're fighting for light. So they have single trunks and they grow upright. And that is what plants from those environments grow like. We live in a very different environment where there's a lot of light. And this is what our native trees really want to do when we leave them alone. This is a funny picture, actually, because this was posted on a Facebook group called Tucson Hates Trees. You should look it up if you don't know about it already. And it's mostly a lot of arborists and people who are lovers of plants, and they post pictures of the terrible things that people do to trees. But someone posted this and says, "Oh my God, they left it alone. How is this possible? It hasn't been pruned up." And this thing it's some weird corner. That's why it's like in a place where no one cares, and so no one's messed with it. The city hasn't messed with it. It's probably on city property, and they just don't have the budget to take care of it, which is awesome. And so it's been left alone. And this is really what our mesquites and our blue Palo Verdes want to do. And it makes sense if you think about it, because we live in an environment with a lot of sun, a lot of really hot, damaging sun. So they're protecting their trunks. In the case of mesquites, there's also some genetic memory there too, because we used to have large mammals here, like really big mammals, and plants in, especially trees in places where there's large herbivores, they push the plants away by expanding wide to push the herbivores away from their trunks. So the velvet mesquite in particular still has this like genetic memory. But anyway, this is what our trees want to do. And this is what we do to those poor trees. And there's a few reasons why we do this. One is the expectations that we have on plants. Two is the environment. We picked the wrong plant for that area. If you have an area and you don't have the room to let the thing grow, don't plant it. Plant something that will actually do well in that environment. Like a Palo Blanco. Palo Blanco should be planted in parking lots because parking lots are warmer, which is better for them. And they naturally grow upright like this. I've seen these guys in Sonora. If you're in Sonora and you travel from the coast to the Sierras, in the middle of the desert, there's these rocky outcrops. And in the rocky outcrops, these Palo Blancos just grow out of like pure rock. And they grow just like this. And the reason that they can handle this is their trunks are, oh yeah, I have a laser pointer. Their trunks here, you can't see this in this picture, but they peel and they're shiny and white, but they have this thick cuticle, which helps protect them from the sun, totally damaging their trunks. And you see this also in a lot of oak species, not our oaks. Our oaks are not like this, but like Chihuahuan oaks. And a lot of other oaks which have a really thick cambium layer. If you know where cork comes from, old cork wine bottles come from an oak species, and they shear off the I think it's a cambium layer. So anyway, they have this really thick trunk that is fairly well protected from the sun. So that's why those trees can grow upright and not get completely damaged by the sun. And we do have a few oaks in our region that are regionally native. There's the Virginia oak, which gets as close as Texas. And there's a bunch of Chihuahuan oaks that also grow straight up. And they don't get molested by the sun. So if you need a tree in a place like this, plant a tree that grows upright like that. Don't plant a Palo Verde or a mesquite. But this is what people are often looking for and they think about. And most of us are not plant people. Well, we're plant people in here. And a lot of people watching this are plant people, but a lot of people are not plant people. Their relationship with nature is through stores, because we've all been trained to be shoppers, not gardeners and landscapers. So we expect things to look like what they're going to be when we put them in the ground. And as opposed to like, I'm buying a young thing, I'm going to plant this thing and it doesn't look anything like it's going to look like. I'm going to take care of it and meet its needs, and it'll become the thing that I want it to be. But that's why we have we constantly say don't treat plants like furniture. The other thing is letting your landscape reflect where you live. And again, this is going back to what most people do. I'm going to grab some water. The nursery industry is completely full of plants that are from elsewhere, and getting people what we're always trying to get people to do is love where they live. Love our landscape, not impose a landscape from elsewhere onto your backyard. This book was one of the greatest books for helping people do that. I'm sure most people in this room have probably read this, but if you haven't, you should have this. You should own this book. This came out around the time that I moved here, around 30 years ago. And when I first saw it and I looked at the pictures, I was so amazed by it. I was like, this is what landscaping can be. It's not pictures that look like a California landscape. It's not like, decomposed granite yards with, it doesn't look like California. It looks like here. And that's because a lot of the pictures are either from habitat or they're from the various botanical gardens. So the plants look more natural, and it's a wonderful book. And Judy's a wonderful woman. She came to our opening for our nursery, and she told me a while ago that she was working on an updated version of this with new plants, a whole bunch of new plants, which I'm really excited about. But we happen to live, it's a good place to be place oriented because we live in a really cool environment. We have the third most diverse of all species. We have the third most diverse in the entire country. That's mammals, reptiles, plants, everything. We're third most diverse in flora and third in fauna. I'm sorry, bird fauna is what I meant to say there. And the second most diverse in butterflies, only beat out by Texas. And by the way, it's usually Texas and California that beat us on diversity. And that's because they got coasts. But they have coasts. Like, you know how many seagulls there are? You know how many, like, that's cheating to me. We come up without the coasts, and that's something to think about because there's a lot of flora and fauna that are very much related to coast, and there's a lot of diversification that comes along with being near a coast. We don't have that, and yet we still compete with California and Texas. And yes, they're also huge. So that's pretty amazing. And we're number one. We're supposed to battle it out with India, I think, with Hymenoptera, which is wasps, bees, and ants. So we live in a cool place. This is a good place to be obsessed with nature. When we personally refer to nature, we are talking about this region. This is where a lot of our plants come from, basically Southwest US and Mexico. And we let it slide in Mexico a little bit. There's some things that we sell that's a little bit more Southern Mexico. But what's really more important to us is not geography, does that plant provide anything for the fauna? Is it a larval host for a butterfly or a moth? Is it feed birds? Is it a nesting site? Will our fauna recognize and be serviced by the fauna? Is it a plant that will be a part of the ecology as opposed to this just thing that you stick in the ground, like those Australian sennas? I hate those things. They're full of domestic bees, and that's it. They don't even, like, it's a senna. And if you know anything about sennas, every senna is going to have larvae in them because there's a really cool larva, they're really cool butterflies that are attracted to sennas, and they use them as larval hosts, except the Australian one. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because that thing is alien. If you look at it, it doesn't look anything like our sennas. It has a different texture. I don't even know if it should be in the same genus, but I'm not a geneticist. But it doesn't service wildlife. And it tends to be plants that are that far away. Of course, they don't have that relationship. They evolved in a completely different environment. So they don't have that relationship with our fauna that our sennas have. And so this always goes back to seeing plants in a different way. Instead of seeing a plant like this object that you want and that you really like, the whole plant lust thing, which I completely understand because I am a plant person, but it's seeing the plant as not just itself, but as this part of a much bigger whole. And that makes gardening and landscaping a lot more fun. I used to be that guy. I used to be the guy that got in, when I came here, this is what I loved, cacti and succulents. This is why I moved here, because I moved here because there was agaves and saguaros. And this picture's terrible. But I was really into weird succulents, and so of course I collected, and I still do. I still have some of these plants. I still have a few African caudiciforms and stuff. But as I've gotten older, and as I've gotten more into ecology, which is funny because my entry into Arizona was ecology, but this is what I was really into. And a lot of ecologists that I know, you go to their house and this is what they got in their yard. But as I've gotten older, this is what I'm into. And it's the thing that I hated back then: grasses and asters. The plants that you used to think they all look the same. This is hopia. what's the common name?
Oh.
Common name.
Vine mesquite.
Yeah, thank you, vine mesquite. It's a spreading native grass. It's really cool. It's got these giant seeds. And this is Barclayanthus salignus, used to be Senecio salignus. Really cool plant. There's alkaloids in the nectar that's very similar to the boraginaceae, and also to you probably all know the blue mist plant and the monarch's relationship to that. If you don't, monarchs utilize this alkaloid in certain plants, and the males gather up the alkaloid, they fly around, they waft it around, and it attracts the females. They mate, and the male passes the alkaloid to the female, and she coats her eggs with it, which makes her eggs inedible or less edible to pests, which is really cool. And most people know about the blue mist flower, which is used for that the most. And they probably don't know that whole story. They just know that it attracts monarchs and queens. But Barclayanthus has that same alkaloid, as do a lot of Senesioid asters. But anyway, I'm into this now. This is so much more interesting because like it's not just the plant. It's this bigger thing. It's a bigger, more interesting thing to look at than just looking at a plant in isolation. You know, like we were just talking about sennas. This is the cloudless sulfur on a native senna. And the sennas, by the way, have like four or five that I know of butterflies that use them as larval hosts. And then there's things like this guy. This is a walking stick that's native to creosote bushes. And look at its body. It's segmented like the creosote bush is segmented. And what's even weirder is when they're younger, they're green, like the green growth on a creosote bush. And then as they get older, they turn brown, like the older growth on a creosote bush. And this thing evolved with creosote bushes. So cool. And most people probably never get to see this thing because, I mean, try to find that thing in your plant and you have to start really looking hard. But what a cool thing. We share this image a lot on our social media, and as many talks as we do, we try to show this image. Do you still dress like this? Then why does your landscape look like this? But to the bigger point, where does our weird obsessions about what plants should behave like come from? It's colonialism. And I know a lot of people are tired of hearing about colonialism, but get used to it because we're dealing with the history of colonialism and what it's done to our world. And it's affected our experience with nature. And especially with plants, like the things we impose on our plants come from, you know, where our people are from, or not all of us. A lot of people aren't from. A lot of people are from here, like indigenous people, but people who aren't Europeans, or if you're from elsewhere and you move to a new place, your relationship with plants was built elsewhere. And this is why land-based people don't do that, because they grew up here. So they don't have this other expectation of like, this is what a tree should look like, and this is what, you know, whatever. This drives me crazy. I read a lot of history, and don't read history if you don't want to be angry, because you will get angry. Arizona history, there was literal public policies to anglicize our landscapes. This actually also ruined architecture for me. I used to love modern architecture and modern design. I hate it now because it's racist. And there's a long history behind that, and you can look it up yourself. But in Arizona, we were literally, there were policies put in place to change the plants in people's yards and in public landscapes. It's one of the reasons that people hate olives and hate mulberries, by the way, because the Spanish got here before us and they planted all these trees that we didn't have a relationship with. And so Anglos got here and they hated these trees. What are these messy trees doing here? I don't know what to do with this thing. And so they hated them. And then they overstated their allergenic issues. And because I'll tell you, olive trees and mulberry trees do not put out more pollen than an oak does. And we plant oaks every day, all the time. That's also a wind pollinated plant. But oaks, olives and mulberries got banned, and it's because, and I think it's a lot of, it goes back to the fact that we didn't have a cultural relationship with those plants. Yeah.
This is an important question.
Yeah.
Our neighbor just planted mulberries in their garden.
Mm-hmm.
Is that why?
That's black mulberry, which, by the way, isn't technically illegal. This is the other thing about when the government does stuff. They don't know what mulberries are. The mulberry species that they officially banned, the botanical name they used, was for a species that's never even been grown here. So I looked that up recently, and I had a conversation with the people at the county, and I was like, you guys know that this is the wrong species anyway. You know, they were planting Morris alba, and I can't remember which species. It was another species from up north that they had banned. The species we sell is the black mulberry, which is a shrub, and it's never been banned. But there's a lot of plants that are wind pollinated, and I have this. I'll talk a little bit more about allergies in a second. Actually, I'll hold that thought. But anyway, there was this attempt to change Arizona's landscape. It didn't hit us as hard in Tucson as it did Phoenix, and you can see that obviously these days, right? But what they considered more Anglo in those days, we're talking like 1950s, is oleanders and arborvitae, junipers, pittosporum. You know, those old plants that are still kind of lingering around in Arizona. You see them, and they're still for sale in a lot of nurseries. And it's not that they do poorly here, but they replaced a lot of native flora and of course the stuff that the Spanish had planted. The other thing about modern design that I absolutely now hate is they look at plants purely by their physical looks, and they do this design. And we did a post not long ago where I said design sucks, and a lot of people got really turned on that. They just like couldn't digest what I was saying. But it's this thing. It's like they can only see like, oh, this is a cool plant with really upright thing. Let's put a ton of them here, but it's just no ecological connection here. There's no sense of place. It's just treating a plant like an object, like a piece of furniture. And that's why we say plants are not furniture. Colonization does this to this beautiful plant. Here, this is not this picture. This is how they should grow. And this is what people do to them. And the colonization is what did this to this tree. Is expecting it to have this single trunk and, you know, canopy. And I don't think that the people who did this trimming job had that expectation. I think the people who planted that there had that expectation. They didn't bother to understand what this plant's like, and they slapped that plant in the ground with having no conception of what that plant does. And that is what is done a lot of the time. I dare say most of the time. The architects who design a lot of landscapes, it's getting better than it used to be, but it's still like mostly people don't know anything about plants and what they do. They don't know anything about their shape. They don't know anything about their life histories. And so this happens. They also expect plants to always look the same. I've even had a few, I'm not going to mention any names, but I had a plant person who called me up and she was like, my plant looks terrible right now. I think it was a wolfberry, and it was summer. Wolfberries go dormant in the summertime. And I told her, it's like, that's what they do. Like wolfberries in Arizona, Lycium, they look like crap in June. And I'm trying to get people to learn to love that, because there's a whole bunch of things that happens with that plant that's very interesting. You know, the plant drops its leaves, they get diseased, like wolfberry, for example. The plant will look like it's sick. The leaves look discolored, and the weird little diseases attack the leaves. And that always happens with plants that go dormant. And it really challenges our conception of what disease is in a plant too. You know, all kinds of organisms will take advantage of that resource. And that happens to all plants that go dormant, and they'll look like crap sometimes. And so, this is desert willow. The picture didn't turn out good on here, but desert willows, a lot of people really don't like their winter look. I love the way they look in winter, but to some people, they don't look that great. But I always ask, like, what do you look like when you get up in the morning? It's weird that we expect this organism to always look best, always look awesome, and then give no room for it to be a living organism. And so this is an expectation that we really try to get. This picture's funny. We really try to get people to stop seeing plants as these inanimate objects that you just place in your yard. I really hate decomposed granite. I'm so sick of this. Do you know why this is a thing in Arizona? It's because we're a mining state. It's because this stuff is just dumped on the market because there's so much of it in the state, and they want to sell it. And a long time ago, the quarries made a big deal with all the developers, and they're like, will you put this crap in your yards and make it a thing, make it an Arizona thing? It's clean, everything will look clean and nice. It goes back to the 50s. And this is horrible for plants, and there's no life in there. I mean, this is hot, it reflects heat. A lot of plants that can take full sun, and we hear a lot of this all the time, like, you said that plant can take full sun, but it burned up. And we get to talking to them, and it's like, it's in a gravel yard, it's in a microwave. And full sun is not the same as reflective heat. When you have rock like this, it bounces that heat right back up, and it just cooks plants. So if you have this in your yard, get rid of it. I know it'll be a big job, but get rid of it. There's always some schmo who will take it for free. Or what's even better is if you have clay soil, dig this into the ground. It's one of the only ways to fix clay soil. Clay soil is really hard. It doesn't breathe really well. And sometimes people add sand to make it better, but sand doesn't work as well. Gravel works great because it holds space for oxygen, and that's the real problem with clay soil. But anyways, that's a much better use than putting it on the ground and turning your yard into a toasted microwave. I took this in front of our house today. This is in front of our house. I want people to start seeing this is beautiful. I'm sure our neighbors hate us, but I don't care. You know who else's yard is like this is Audubon Society in the front of their yard. They have all those overgrown wolfberries, and I love that yard. I love that yard. And if you go in there, there's always activity going on in there. So, you don't have to plant. You don't have to plant smartly. There's things in here that are too close together. But our goal is wildlife. So there's so much stuff going on in here. I can't tell you how many cool wasps we had this year, like different species, like more species this year than we had the previous years. Every year we see new insects that we didn't see the year before. And that's because every year our yard builds up in species diversity and in coverage. And so we have just more wildlife. I want to redo this. This is an old famous graphic, and I want to redo this for our area, but we still have this. And the reason I'm bringing this up is when I say, like, you can't just look at plants, and you can't just look at plants in isolation, I don't just mean insects and birds and reptiles. I also mean dirt. And a lot of what we think of as desert soil is not. What we think of is, we've been taught that desert soil is disturbed soil. And I think I even learned that in one of my ecology classes. And then I learned later that that's BS. And what we're dealing with these days is a lot of disturbed soil, because we really did a number on our landscape. We caused a lot of erosion, and we caused a lot of loss of successional history. So successional history is on this end on the left end here of the graphic, you have disturbance. And that could be in nature. That doesn't happen as often as it happens now with humans doing what they do. But when you have a major disturbance, you have a wipeout of life, and you start from zero. And I always think, because I was I was a kid when Mount St. Helens blew up, and I was there, and it was amazing. The landscape got completely no life on that landscape, and things have come through, and that's succession. So starting from the left, you have soil that's like devoid of biology, and as things grow, the first things that come up are a lot of the time legumes and other plants that can fix nitrogen, and they grow and they die and they grow and they die, and animals come and they grow and they die and they poop, and as time goes on, things get more and more bigger and they get woodier, and the wood brings fungus. And on the far right there, you have what's considered old growth, and we have old growth. It just doesn't look like Oregon. It looks like, you know, the more untouched untouched areas in Saguaro National. If you can find them, they're getting harder to find, but we don't have like, you know, 20 feet of topsoil, but we have the diversification of microbes in the soil. We get more fungal and more diversity in both bacteria and fungus and protozoans and other things. So this is something to think about too. And I put this in the background of a picture I took today under my hackberry. So we have this giant canyon hackberry in the back of our yard, and or the side of our yard. And man, soil under a hackberry is amazing. It just dumps all these leaves every year, and we leave them, and the soil just gets more and more amazing every year. And that is like, not the whole desert is not like what your friends back east think, right? And you know that, but that goes back to the soil too. We're not just all dunes, you know, we're not just all creosote flats in the Mojave. We have mesquite bosque, and then if you go up in elevation, of course, we have oak forest and other things. But our soil is not disturbed soil, and so letting your soil do this, letting the organic material hang around. That's not just advice for people back east, making their maple leaves. It's for us too, and it's changing what's beautiful. So starting to see this in your yard as beautiful is a really wonderful thing when you start doing that. This is some depressing news. This information came out recently by Xerces Society, and this includes Tucson. It was in the study. 100% of the milkweeds that were grown for monarchs and sold for monarchs were tested, and 100% of them contained pesticide. And that was both, it wasn't just Home Depots, that was local nurseries and chains. And in Tucson, there was a larger local nursery that was tested, and then there was a chain that was tested. So 100% from coast to coast in this country, and that goes to this sad truth that horticulture is toxic, and nurseries are toxic places. And so we're trying our best to be to have as least of this as possible. We never spray anything. We don't even use synthetic fertilizers. We use fishing emulsion. You can smell it sometimes when you come to the nursery. But I'd rather it stink like fish or poop in our nursery than be toxic, especially since people buy plants from us to feed their tortoises. And I always think about that, like people buying plants for their tortoises at other places, and kind of sketchy. And this is, again, as it always goes back to managing expectations. When people see this in the nursery, we leave the aphids on our milkweeds and a few other plants. Aphids, they cause relatively little damage to a plant, so long as the plant's getting all its other needs met. If it's in the wrong sun, or if it's not watered right, then things can go a little haywire. But if you're giving the plant what it needs, it's fine. And something always catches up with it. And so we always get people to focus on, not on pests, but on meeting the needs of the plants, because most pests that attack your plants are attacking your plants because they're not exactly happy, or they're not pests, or it's just an insect plant. But if there are pests that are really truly causing true decline, that's really rare in nature. I really try to get people to stop being dramatic. And also, when you fail, you haven't failed. Nature is just more complex than you know. You do not always know why something happened to a plant. Get over it. It's fine. It's life. Like things die, and you know, we just get people. I'm glad that there's a lot of people who really care about their plants and they call us every day. But sometimes they call us about the smallest little things. There's a brown spot on my plant. Oh my God, is it dying? I'm like, it's fine. It looks really great, actually. But so I'm glad that people are starting to pay attention to what's going on in the plant. But I really want people to, you know, go back to like, what do you look like in the morning? It's okay that plants look funky sometimes. And sometimes you will have a failure. Sometimes something happens and we don't know exactly what it is. But I promise you that the more you pay attention to what a plant needs, give it the sun it needs, make sure that you have a kind of an understanding about the soil that it needs. And if you don't know, ask us. And if we don't know, we'll ask someone who knows. But we most of the time know, but we don't know everything. And especially since some of the plants that we're growing have never been grown in cultivation or rarely have. Sometimes we just don't know. And so you have to also accept if you're growing weird plants, if you're growing cool things, expect that you're going to fail sometimes because we don't always know how to grow plants. Sometimes they have these secret relationships with microbes that we don't even understand. And so it's a whole part of horticulture we haven't even scratched the surface with. This is our job every day. Katie and I very patiently try to tell people to chill out. They see a bug on a plant and they're just certain that that it's killing their plant. And especially that guy. People just obsessed with this. That's a Palo Verde beetle, by the way. And Palo Verde beetles are everywhere else you go. They will tell you Palo Verde beetles kill Palo Verde trees. Palo Verde beetles have been here for millions of years. Palo Verdes have been here for millions of years, longer than we've been bipedal. And they worked out their differences a long time ago. And that is sort of a staple of like established ecology. After long periods of time with organisms living with each other, they sort of develop a balance. Because if you wipe out your food source, what happens to you? You die. And I know this is a hard concept for humans because we wipe our food sources out every day. Or I shouldn't say humans. I actually hate saying humans because it's not all humans. Colonizing humans, instead of being land-based and living where they live and living within the limits of their landscape, they go outward when they exhaust their own resources. They go elsewhere. And that's why colonization sucks. But I won't turn this into colonization. Palo Verdes don't kill Palo Verde trees. They mostly eat dead wood. They may eat some green wood once in a while. They do not kill Palo Verdes. But what happens is sometimes a Palo Verde is declining. Sometimes it's just old. Sometimes the water table is dropping, and it was dependent on that. And they look for, what is it? What's killing my tree? And they look at the most obvious things. And that's what we do as human beings. We look at like what's obvious in our face. And they're like this big, ugly, bat-sized beetle with a giant pickled, grubby looking thing. That's creepy. That's got to be killing my tree. It's not. And if you leave things alone long enough, like those aphids we were looking at before, there's always something that will come in and take it. This was done by parasitoid wasps. Leave things alone. And the thing about this too, the wasps and, well, there's many organisms that are nestled in with aphids, like all these guys, all these larvae, hoverfly, lacewing, ladybugs. There's so many insects that predate on aphids. And if you leave them alone, you'll see them go away. And I'm talking about, don't spray them with water either, because you spray these guys off. And you know what? These guys take a lot longer to come back. The aphids, bam, right back. They reproduce so fast. So the more you fight aphids, the more aphids you make for yourself, because they're going to come right back, especially if it's warm out. And these guys, their life cycle is just a lot longer. So you're actually making more aphids when you fight them. Leave them alone. Just focus on the plant and what it needs. And we talk about this every day. I get tagged every day on Tucson Backyard Gardening, which is another site that I try to not look at too much or I get too angry. But the grubs, are demonized. And it's mostly, again, from elsewhere. Like if you go back east, where I'm from in New York, and all the whole East Coast is having this issue with Japanese beetle. Japanese beetle is a non-native insect that was introduced to a landscape that's completely decimated. Like the native flora and fauna are gone. And so, yeah, Japanese beetles just wreaking havoc because it's non-native plants and it's non-native insect. It's just like what is the fights the Romans did with each other? Yeah, it's like gladiators, just like go at it, guys. Who's gonna win? Who knows? But we're lucky that we still live in a place with our fauna intact. And when you have your native fauna intact, they keep out the non-native fauna. It's a space that's taken up. And pests don't like competition. They're opportunistic organisms. They love agriculture and they love landscapes that are completely decimated. But when you have native fauna, you don't have Japanese beetle. Those are fig beetle larvae, by the way. And our garden is full of them. And so I swear to God, I've very patiently tried to describe to people. And I actually posted a video some time ago too, like, here's my garden full of grub worms. Here's our plants, they're doing just fine. And in fact, grub worms do the same exact work that earthworms do. They eat detritus, they eat organic material, and they aerate your soil. And they might nibble on a root now and then, but so do the larvae of butterflies. Like, it doesn't kill the plant. If the plant's healthy, it'll be fine. And if my garden, with as many grubs as it has, is surviving just fine, then so will yours. But what's usually happening is, again, something happens, they're not sure what it is. It's usually their own fault. They're usually not willing to admit that they weren't watering quite the way they should, or they have their garden in too much shade, and then they're having problems because of that, and they blame the big ugly grub because it's easy to demonize. Here's another thing we talk about all the time too: big leaf skeletonizers. They're native moths. They're pretty. Actually, this picture doesn't even do justice. They're like this metallic bluish purplish moth that almost looks like a wasp. It's a beautiful insect. And our grapes in containers in the nursery and in the ground get hit several times a year. And people have sworn to me that these things have killed their plants, and they haven't. Something else happened. And it's usually water, because it's hot here, and people, especially in containers, like, you get up every day to water, and it gets really hot in the summer. You're like, maybe I don't want to get out this morning. And you don't want to quite admit it. That's probably what's happening. I always bring up the mesquite, and I put this name up here to freak everybody out, because guess what? It's not Prosopis velutina anymore. It's Naltuma velutina now. Don't worry, on our website we still say Prosopis, but we do have a little line that says, by the way. Yeah, velvet mesquite is it's a keystone species, and one of the reasons it's so cool is because of the insects. There's so many insects that are in mesquites. The thing that they call borers, oh, the borers killed my trees. Borers feed on dead wood, and so there is often a lot of dead wood in mesquites, and they will utilize that resource. And old mesquites are often bleeding, and they're messy. They do things that we don't like, and we think of it as unhealthy. But again, focus on taking care of the plant, making sure, especially in mature mesquites, they are riparian trees. They grow near rivers. You have your true riparians in the middle of the rivers, like your ash and your cottonwood and your willows, and then just to the outside of that, you have the mesquite bosque. And those plants really rely on water, and people don't often water their mesquites correctly. And so that's why they decline. But again, millions of years, this plant has evolved with those insects. And I just love watching these trees and seeing what shows up in them. Just the most amazing insects ever. some I don't even know anything about. We constantly run into insects. I'm just like, I don't know this thing's life history at all. And neither does anybody else. Like even the entomologist, I don't know this. I know this thing exists, but I don't know what it does. And then the ones that they do know about, you're like, how did you figure that out? And I'll get to one actually of those. But the mesquite, a lot of you might know this story, but the Lucy's warbler is completely dependent on the native mesquite because of the relationship that this tree has with insects. When this tree breaks bud in the spring, there's a lot of fluid in the tree, a lot of sugars, sap, I guess it is. And it's not flower stuff, it's when the buds break, and that is food for a lot of insects. So the mesquites attract loads of insects. And this guy shows up to take advantage of that at the time that they emerge. And so Lucy's warbler, as of late, they've suddenly realized like, there might be a problem with the Lucy's warbler in urban areas. And that's because people are planting non-native mesquites and hybrids that do not have those same traits. And it's stark, the difference between the life inside of a Chilean mesquite and the life inside of a native velvet mesquite, it's night and day. They're completely different trees. Also, if you like your trees not to be split down the middle and falling over, this tree evolved with our monsoons. And so long as you haven't been butchering it with your pruning methods, they will handle our storms much better than the non-native mesquites. The non-native mesquites became popular because of people's expectations, because Chilean mesquites, I'm talking about the ones with the big thorns. The thornless one is also called Chilean, but the South American mesquites tend to grow more upright. And the nurseries loved that because that's what people expected. They wanted a tree that had a trunk and it looked like a tree. And so that's why those became more popular and the natives were less popular. Because why would you introduce another mesquite? That's the silliest thing ever, but that's what we did and that's why. But unfortunately, those trees do not have those wildlife relationships because they didn't evolve here. Of course, this is the gateway into wildlife gardening and why a lot of people first start coming to us. And then like any good drug dealer, we start to get them into other drugs. And so we remind them like, the monarch is not the only butterfly that has specific larval hosts. All these butterflies do too. And the more you plant the larval hosts for these butterflies in your yard, they'll show up. And I swear to God, like in our yard, which started off as an empty landscape, we will plant something and things show up and it's really cool. And it seems like magic to me still. I know the science behind it. Plants have chemistry. They atomize in the air and those little atoms are floating around in the air and it's like breadcrumbs. And the butterflies have sensory organs that pick up those little molecules and they follow them and it brings them to the plant. But even though I know that, every time I plant something and something shows up that wasn't there before, it's just amazing to me, especially when it's something that's I know none of my neighbors have. And especially I've noticed that with moths. So once we get people addicted to this drug, to these drugs, the butterflies, we get them addicted to moths because moths are cool too. And they're even cooler because you have to work harder to see them because most of them are nocturnal, but they're amazing and they're huge. Some of our moths, we live in a really good moth area. I don't know where we are in terms of like moth diversity in the country, but I bet we're up there. If butterflies are number 2, we're at least number 2. We have some cool moths here. And then if we can get them to love moths, then we kind of move on to beetles. Basically, we're just trying to get people to love bugs. And bugs are fascinating. You start to learn their life histories, and it's just mind-boggling. And of course, the bees. And bees, wasps, and Hymenoptera in general. But we live in the #1 diversity spot in the world for bees. The wasps, I just love so much. This is one that, we have several species. This one's always been in our yard, since we've moved there. And there's various species of mud wasps, and I took a picture of this morning. This is all over our house, these mud wasp nests. And this one's nice and neat. So I think it's the black and yellow mud dauber. And then actually, you know what? I see, never mind. See how it's like caked on the outside there? That's the work of, I think, the blue and white one. I'm not an entomologist, but we see these wasps when we watch them. And one of the wasps utilizes the architecture of the old wasp. And the one that builds the really nice, neat ones, when they're done with it, the other one comes in and blobs some more mud on there and reuses it. So that, like the recycler, they're the renters of the world. And of course, these too, we have all over too. People are afraid of wasps. But we found that we leave them alone, they leave us alone. We had one of these in our door jamb above our door, and didn't even notice until it got big enough where we looked up and we're like, oh, I don't know how we missed it. Well, it's kind of because it was in between the screen and the door. So it was easy to miss, kind of. And then one day we looked up and like, oh, we've been walking under this thing like every day. Seriously, if you leave them alone, they do so much good work for your yard, and they belong here. This is a tough sell for a lot of people, but this is another insect that gets blamed for killing plants. I saw something today or yesterday, we posted about Cleveland sage, and someone's like, oh, I had 2 Cleveland sages that were killed by the harvester ants. These guys don't really kill plants. And again, we know this because we allow them to strip our plants, and they always come back. Again, meet the needs of the plant. What often happens is the plant will get denuded, and people are like, well, I guess they killed my plant, and they stop watering it. And that's what kills the plant. Or again, some need wasn't met before. It's not in the right sun. It's not getting watered right. That's what's really happening. These guys have been here longer than we've been here. So they belong here, and they've evolved this relationship. What's cool about these guys, by the way, ants don't eat leaves. They eat protein. So they eat bugs and sometimes seeds. But these guys collect leaves too. And what they do with the leaves is they grow fungus. This is under the ground. And they're feeding this fungus with leaf debris, and then they eat the fungus, or they feed it to their young. So that's pretty cool. And plus, when the males do their thing, that's food. Always look at everything in your yard as it's a resource for something else. So these male insects are an important food for so many birds and reptiles and everybody. So I get excited about ants when they show up in our yard, but they can be annoying. There's a part of my yard in the summertime that I know I can't walk in as well, and I get bit, and I curse at them. But I also realize that they belong there. And again, aerating the soil, improving the biology of the soil, turning our eroded, destroyed landscapes into a living landscape. Plus, they make cool artwork. This is in our new spot. It's currently a grow yard, but these are harvester ants, and all around there is those are leucophyllum flowers. Probably the hardest people to convince about leaving bugs alone are cacti and succulent collectors. And I have a long history with these guys because, I came here, when I first moved here, I was living with Richard Felger, and he was like, you need to get to know these guys. And so he'd send me off to all these guys to get to know, and that included a lot of the cacti and succulent people. And of course, I'm friendly with all those people. And I get it. I get where they're coming from, and I get their love of cacti and succulents, but they have to have these plants look perfect. They won't allow the plant to have spots on it, especially agaves. And I get it why cactus people hate this bug particularly, because it will just melt your agave down. But what's really interesting about this bug is, number one, first of all, it's attacking mostly non-native agaves. Agave weberi and Agave americana are most likely to succumb to this bug. And usually those plants are in one of those gravel landscapes with a bunch of reflected heat, and they're not as happy as they could be. So they're a little more susceptible. And most of the predation happens on plants that are not as healthy. So there's that. But the other interesting thing is, like, you think about, well, why this is thing that evolved in ecology and it kills the agave. Isn't that a bad thing for ecology? How did it survive? Agaves sucker, especially the agaves that this guy evolved with, and they take out the main guy. You know what that allows? All those pups to grow, and they matured. So the interesting thing about this insect is it actually makes more agaves in its native landscape. So that's pretty cool, but it's hard to sell cacti and succulent people on that idea. We are constantly fighting bugs that we have to do some research on. And this is a good one. When we found this, you can see it's dead. But we found this and we're like, what is this? And we figured it out. This thing has the coolest life history. The adults lay eggs on the flowers of Palo Verde trees. The larva hangs out on the flower and waits for a native bee, these solitary native bees, to come by, the males, and they hitch a ride on the bee. And I just think of like never-ending story, like Atreyu, like riding this bee, and the bee finds a female, and they mate, and that little larva pops onto the female, and rides the female to the underground location where they lay their eggs and the provisions for the larva, and then the larva is there, and it's like, thank you for bringing me to a food place, and they eat all the provisions and they eat the larva. It's so cool, and it's a blister beetle. And the first thing that when you hear about blister beetles, like, don't touch them, you get blisters. Yeah, don't touch them, but they're not going to go after you. And it's just cool that this thing exists, and that it has that life history. Another thing that every day, like, people are like, the mistletoe killed my tree. It's always that something's wrong with the tree. These things have evolved with each other forever. As long as I've been here, there's this tree in Menlo Park that's absolutely loaded with mistletoe, and it's been there 30 years. 30 years, and it's fine. It doesn't look like what people want it to look like. It looks like kind of like that, but it's full of I don't know if up in the corner there you can see there's a phainopepla up there. A phainopepla looks like a black cardinal, and it only comes this time of year because this guy's starting to fruit. And then they depend on these fruits. And then what they usually do is move up in elevation as each mistletoe and each elevation starts fruiting. So this is fruiting now in the low desert into spring. And then late spring, early summer, they move up to the oak woodland and go after that mistletoe. So they move their way up in elevation. But and so that's why they're only here, except in our neighborhood, there was a couple of them that hung out, and they were there all summer, and we couldn't figure out what they were eating. And then we realized that one of our neighbors has an enormous graythorn, Ziziphus, which is it was full of fruits. And that's what these guys are, they're fruit eaters. The other thing to love about the mistletoe is that this is the larval host of one of the most beautiful butterflies, I think, the great purple hair streak. So they use it as a larval host. And if you get to see this butterfly, it's usually hanging out in canopies, so you don't get to see them. But they come down once in a while. I've noticed the adults on flowers of cat claw acacia. Did you have a question?
Well, I know that you have so much to share with us, but I think maybe some people do have questions, and I'm
okay.
To have time.
I am almost at the end here, so I'll rush through this. I did want to address this plant really quick too, because a lot of people get upset about wind pollinated plants. But this is burr sage, and it is wind pollinated. The very interesting thing about burr sage is there was more of it when people moved here to escape their allergies. And what has changed? So most of you probably know this. The 1800s, people moved here because they had tuberculosis or they had really bad allergies and asthma, and they moved here for the clean air. There wasn't the pollen. And yet there were more of these guys. And actually there were more olives, and there were more the other trees that aren't even wind pollinated, but palo verdes and mesquites that people think they're allergic to. There were more of all those things. What has changed between then and now? And that's disturbed landscapes. So we've bulldozed Arizona, and it's just this dirt to air ratio, and a lot of the pollen that's in the air is not even, it's old pollen that's been around for hundreds of years or even thousands of years, because pollen really lasts forever, and other things. And pollen is overemphasized in air quality tests because it's one of the few things that they can identify. When you look at air quality and all the particles that are in the air, they don't know what half that stuff is, or they don't want to talk about it because there's chemicals, there's agricultural chemicals that are now in our air that we don't want to talk about. But pollen's overemphasized. But the other interesting thing is if there was more of this, there would be more, it's a pioneer plant. It locks soil down, and it actually helps repair landscapes. That's its sole function in life. And just quickly, humans are part of ecology too. And this is something that, especially later in my life, that I've been learning about. I highly recommend these books. Both of these books are really great. They're both botanists, but they're indigenous. And one of the things that's different about land-based people is that they do not see themselves separate from ecology. They see themselves as part of ecology. So it's the reason that the autumn didn't wipe out Chiltepin, because they depended on it, and they didn't go elsewhere once it ran out. They instead didn't make it run out. So they had an established relationship. And some of the things that indigenous humans did is do things that encourage plants to grow, as you'll find out when reading, especially reading sweetgrass. Humans are part of ecology, and it's only a modern human thing to think that we're not part of it, and that's one of the biggest problems, I think. And so while I'm always definitely trying to get people to make their yards look like this, I also think that it's good to encourage people to grow food plants. And we sell a lot of food plants. We encourage a lot of growing of food plants, because it's one of the best ways for you to develop a personal relationship with plants, and to do so in a way that supports wildlife, of course, not harms wildlife. Here's a wolfberry that we have several in our yard. Here's wolfberry syrup that we made. We rendered it down with some simple sugar. But I think we used brown sugar. No, we used regular sugar on that. So made a simple syrup and then added the wolfberry, and it was delicious and unlike any flavor I know. We made really wonderful cocktails out of this. Again, this plant, interesting that it's an allergenic plant. It's one of the best herbal remedies for allergies. And that's another thing that I was trained to like poo-poo, like, oh, herbal medicine, that's the hippies. But herbal medicine, it's important enough and real enough that the drug companies spend millions and billions of dollars trying to figure out how these plants work, and then they make a drug to sell to you when you could just be taking a plant in your own backyard. And that's something that I've really had to struggle with. You know, I learned regular science, so I learned to like poo-poo a lot of indigenous science and folk science, and it's something that I'm unlearning. And here's a really good example, and it's not unscientific. It's actually scientifically valid that this plant is effective against allergies. But we've all been trained to think, oh, well, the drugs store is where you get your medicine. You don't get that out of your yard. That's what the hippies do. It's just not true. So anyway, that's the end of my thing. If you don't already follow us, we talk about stuff all the time and in more depth. I probably went over time, and that's because there's so much to talk about when it comes to wildlife. Like there's a lot to get out there, and this is probably too big of a subject for a single presentation, but we talk about it every day on all of we're actually even on TikTok. So
you do dances?
No. Well, I don't do the dances, TikTok dances. I do my own dance. So follow us on our stuff and our website. We're about to update our website. We're changing some things and making it even more navigable. So expect that. But anyway, questions? Yes.
One other question. So I don't know what the number is, but the native mesquite supports, I'm making this up, I don't know, say 200 insects. Maybe, I don't know what it is. Say a Chilean mesquite supports 25.
Mhm.
I'm making that up too. But if they hybridize, is there like a median in there, or is it like all?
I'll say my experience with that, personal experience with that, is that, and I see it every day actually. It's everywhere. Like if you go around the urban areas of Tucson, the trees are getting hybridized because of the Chilean mesquite. Something like your neighbors has a Chilean mesquite, and you may have a native mesquite, but the seeds from your native mesquite are going to be hybridized. And personally, I've noticed that a lot of those trees have way less of those traits. It may not, and it's not going to be an exact. Genetics is like rolling dice, so we can't predict it. But in general, in the urban areas, the mesquites in general are servicing wildlife less, which is why the Lucy's warbler was noticed, because it was not as happy here, and they're still doing research on that, but they're realizing that it's because of the non-native mesquites. It's not just the planting of them, but they are hybridizing our native mesquites. So the end result is that you're having the genetics of those native mesquites are getting hybridized. So when we sell mesquites, all our mesquite, the seed comes from way west, where there's no urban development. So there's no Chilean mesquites basically. And so the only people I trust are us and desert survivors. And that's because we both get our mesquites we get from Bernie. And Bernie is aware of this. So anyway, it's super important. And how much the hybrids are going to be good for wildlife or not is up in the air. And as time goes on, it gets worse because people are, the non-native mesquites are still pretty popular. So, and also most nurseries that sell quote unquote velvet mesquites are not selling velvet mesquites. I see it every day. People who thought they've got a velvet mesquite, and it's like, no, that's hybridized. That's because local nurseries don't have an ecological understanding. They don't know. So they oh, that's velvet, and they collect the seed from it. And they don't take the time to find seed that's not hybridized.
How far do you have to go away from Tucson?
Far enough away. Think about bees and how far they travel. And they travel far. So the seeds that we depend on are they're east of Marana, so that far.
You mean west of Marana?
I'm sorry, west of Marana. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
So you guys are not open right now?
We've reopened on Friday.
Oh, that's nice. You guys are on for a little bit?
Not yet. No, we bought a new property. We're going to be moving there at some point, but the nursery that was before us didn't really do a lot of zoning stuff.
I saw them. Yeah, I toured it when they were for sale. It's good, awesome.
Yeah, we just have to make it wheelchair accessible and make sure it's safe. But we are there. We're growing there, so it's not like we're losing money. We're there growing, and we're going to be on Broadway for a little while longer until we. It's just going to cost more money than we thought to renovate the building.
Does the Chilean mesquite also hybridize with the Evangelist?
Yes. Yeah. The only one that doesn't hybridize is the screwbean, and we now know that's another genus. So.
What I also wanted to say about our so it's not called anymore right now. Their relationship with megafauna and how they grow. I feel like you see it a lot in acacia and Africa.
Yeah. Can the people online can't hear his question, right?
I'm typing in the question.
Oh, you are. Yeah. So so that's why African trees grow that way. And you've seen the pictures, I'm sure. They grow really wide, and that's because they still have their megafauna.
I've been down there, and I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Plants rule the deserts of the world.
They grow sideways. Yeah. And that's what velvet mesquite does too. So if you want a velvet mesquite in your yard, have some space. And I highly recommend it, but 50 feet, give it 50 feet to grow, because it will grow 50 feet wide eventually. Were there any online questions?
Yeah, so let me zoom back up here. we actually had one that was about the snout-nosed beetle, and I think you did a pretty good job of answering that one. But I have one that's a specific question. I spent months fighting with the company last year as they were wanting all weeds removed from around my property. Weeds were perceived as wildfire fuel, and removal was enforced with threat of non-renewal. Any suggestions about how I can convincingly convey that what they call weeds are not always fire fuel in the event they return?
That's a tough one because you're dealing with people who are not ecologists, but I will say this. The low desert does not carry fire. It is why buffalo grass is a problem, because buffalo grass does carry fire. Our native grasses aren't as thick and they're not as fuely. And so our native plants, because they don't carry fire, the larger native plants have not evolved with fire. And so many of our trees do not come back. We are not a fire climax community. That's why A Mountain looks like crap right now, because they set it on fire every 4th of July. But what I would say to that is that our native flora, so if you're talking about like wildflowers, you know, the weeds, like the poppies and the lupin and the native grasses, those don't carry enough fuel to be a fire hazard because we don't live in a fire climax community. It's the non-native plants that are a fire hazard. So that's if they're logical and reasonable, then you can tell them that. But most of them are not going to be. Honestly, like most of the experience I've had with a lot of these, you know, what do they call this? Yeah, HOAs and such. They're just not they're not people who pay attention to nature at all. So it's really hard to convince them because they have this conception of what nature is, and it's not close to what it actually is.
And then we have a question: is it unique to the Southwest to cover plants for frost, such as we have been having recently? Is it possible to plant such that no covering is really needed?
Yeah, absolutely. People cover too much. People think they need to cover all their plants. What you need to do is pay attention to part of the reason we have to cover some of our plants is we live in a cool place with a lot of biodiversity and a lot of elevation. And we live in a place where the tropics receded. And a good example of that is the coral bean, Erythrina flagelliformis, is a tree. But here it's like this squatty little shrub that you find in the foothills. It used to be tropical here. The tropics receded when it got cold in the last ice age, and some plants found little nooks and crannies and they survived. That is the coral bean. And then also we just have areas like the Oregon Pipe National Monument where a lot of really cool plants are growing and people want to grow those plants. And they're going to be more frost tender than a plant that is native in the Tucson Basin. So, even with native plants, you're always going to find frost tender plants, but most of them will come back from a frost. And that's that whole thing about letting a plant be ugly for a minute. A lot of plants like the Erythrina is actually, the coral bean is an ugly plant for, ugly, I put that in quotes. It's an ugly plant for quite a while before it becomes the beautiful thing that it is when it's blooming or when it leaves out. It's 3/4 of the year it's dormant. Same with Jatropha, but anyway, plants that are most of our plants are hardy actually. And I'm glad that people are thinking about covering their plants, but it's like watering. When you first learn about watering, then you overwater, and then you back it up, and then you learn how to properly water plants. But it's always that people don't water enough. They learn about plants, they water too much, and then they back it up. And that's the same with frost. Like they don't cover plants. Some of their plants freeze, then they cover everything, and then they realize, oh, it's only the 4 plants I need to cover. So.
And then we have a comment that I think is a great comment. Plant a Candelia globosa and watch the bee show when it blooms. I have the second record of a Sphinx morpha species for Arizona in my yard. Love that plant. Great talk. Yeah,
I love Candelia. Another one I will throw out there is Arizona milkweed. We have some friends that are in the Huachuca studying that. You mentioned how many species are on a mesquite. These people are counting how many pollinators are utilizing Arizona milkweed, and I think they're in the 500s. of species. So Arizona milkweed, or any milkweed really, it's not just a monarch and queen larval host food. I wouldn't call it a keystone species, but I call it its own ecology. It's got its own, so much going on in that one little plant.
Any other questions in the room?
Just a comment, I was really surprised you didn't say anything about foothills palo verdes.
Oh, I love,
Because those things,
yeah,
after our mega drought,
yep,
blue palo verdes, desert museum palo verdes, mesquites that were planted in upland situations have been crashing and burning.
yep.
And foothills palo verdes, man, they're coming on strong.
I did want to talk about them, but as you see, I'm pretty long-winded as it is, and then I gotta watch myself. But the foothill palo verde it's a wonderful one, and if you're into edible things, the flowers are a lot more edible as well than the blue palo verde. They're better tasting, and yeah, it's a super cool plant, and it of course has a ton of cool endemic insect relationships.
Way underused.
Yeah, it is. It's a hard sell sometimes because people, it's definitely a bushy plant when it's young. All right.
Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.